Okay, so we are in a coaching call with some folks from the Ethos Dojo discussing pre-regionals, how to win out rounds, especially when you haven't been all the time. And the first principle of winning out rounds is to stack the odds in your favor, because at this moment, the debate rounds are won in the margins and not necessarily in who has the better strategy. Okay, who has the better strategy is important, but it's going to be execution of that and then the comparison of very little things that your audience may not even have words for or may not even know they're considering. But consider this, which is that many of these outrounds decisions will be split, and that means that there is a good reason to vote for either team in many audiences' eyes. So because you're dealing with good reasons that any audience could vote for one way or the other, oftentimes it's going to come down to some very marginal issues, and those are the odds you need to stack. The first and foremost among them is being likable. So you want to be the person who makes folks laugh at the right time, or the person who brings it down and makes people consider how serious the issue really is, and this matters because it's talking about real people, if that's the way that you want to go. But you have to be the person who exudes credibility and likability. Nothing in cross-examination that makes the other person look bad or frustrated, or you look mean or too aggressive or any of that stuff. In addition to that, you should be dressing to contrast with your personality. We've talked before about lights versus darks and how a darker personality, such as mine, shouldn't be wearing a dark brown hoodie. If I'm debating, I should be wearing the white shirt underneath, even though I far prefer debating in a black suit with a black shirt and a black tie and black pants and a black watch and a black fedora, if you'll let me. So for me, I prefer to that's what I'm attracted to, is wearing darker clothing and stuff. I should probably wear light to create a contrast, whereas somebody like Alec Light, who's on this call, ironically is light, and should be wearing darker clothing to make it seem like he's not as, so dark on dark seems mean and angry. Light on light can seem airheaded or reaching too hard. They're reading from a script when they talk about ideas. The contrast makes you seem typically more reasonable and like the person that we can trust. Other things that you can do on the margins are investing in gripping rhetoric. That means the figures of speech that we talk about all the time, having a great opening line and closing line for any speech that you give. And every time you stand up at the lectern, that's a speech. A good closing line is not, and for all these reasons, vote for the negative team. It's also not, oh, we're out of time, so blah, 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 blah. It's also not the end of the last argument you were making. It's because justice, the economy, and frankly, every person who has to enter the federal system deserves better. That's why you should reform immigration courts, or whatever it is. You need to have that perfect final sentence. It doesn't have to be in all glory, but it has to be a pretty perfect sentence. Opening and closing every speech with these, and then as much as possible, using some great figures inside of your speaking is going to help you be the one that's remembered, more enjoyable, and more likable. That's a margins thing to do. Another margins thing to do is to listen to the hooks and intros your opponents use. So for example, I was just debating Wiley Walker. I have my flows. Okay, he opened with this analogy about someone taking steroids and competing in sports. And we were talking about the developing nations versus the environment LD resolution in STOA, which he's getting ready for Nighthawk for. And what I always do when there's a kind of compelling hook or intro from the other team is I try to turn it. And so one of the major responses that I had to his on-case arguments were that his examples were not coming from developing nations, but from developed nations. And so I used that same theme here. I said, there's a huge difference between taking steroids and going on your first diet or going to the gym for the first time. And when you're talking about developing nations, we're not talking about, the United States versus Canada, who can get ahead economically by sacrificing our resources. We're talking about people just getting started. And that took away the power from a hook that had previously been given and made me seem like the more reasonable person because I got more specific. Those are the kinds of things that I'm always looking to do to create marginal differences between myself and my opponent. Other marginal things you can do. One of my favorites is not having sloppy pages flying everywhere, but having one of those little, a black 1/4-inch 3-ring binder, and any quotes that I'm going to walk up to the lectern and use, instead of having loose sheets of paper, I stick them into the 3-ring binder, and I walk up there with a 3-ring binder, I open it, and there they are, they're in order, I close it, I go back to my lectern. That is just a tiny thing you can do, or back to the table, a tiny thing you can do to be more organized and more polished. What else can you do at the margins? Those are some big things. So then, when it comes to the outround itself, let's talk about walking in the room. Where what you want to avoid is looking like you're the one that has a bunch of teeny bopper friends. And that means you don't want to have a mob of 12 to 15-year-old fans coming up before the round or after the round to talk to you and mob your table, because that actually gives the underdog syndrome to your opponents. Not in the sense that your audience thinks the other side is an underdog, but in the sense that you seeming more popular actually can be against you when it's at the teenage level. That kind of came out really convoluted, but I think you see what I'm saying. Keep it professional. The moment you walk in, you are a professional. And you look like one, you act like one, you don't wait until the time starts, or that stupid little thing where everybody kind of awkwardly looks around and then you nod and you stand up and walk and shake the hand. Before the moment you're in the room, you are the professional. And that needs to be maintained until the audience leaves the room. That's pretty important. Okay, asking about judges' information. This is a huge pet peeve of mine. I just was at a tournament and they asked, what is your background in debate, and do you have any preferences when you're looking at a parley debate? Like, oh yeah, I did a lot of debate. And then I said, I think that as a judge, I have to use weighing mechanisms in my ballot, because most people are going to be winning some and losing some arguments at the end of the round. And if I don't have an articulated weighing mechanism as to what's most important, I'll have to decide what's important. That's a judge intervention. You don't want that. I think that having a weighing mechanism is the most important thing you could do in this round. Also, you can't get a 30 on my ballot unless you make me laugh. And the entire round went on, and as most rounds do, I know after 10 years of coaching, I'm a little cynical about this, because no one had a weighing mechanism. And at the end of the round, I had to do exactly what I predicted I would have to do, which is one team won this point about the economy and another team won this point about life, but it was like small. I had to weigh those two against each other, myself, because neither team argued that one or more was more important. Most of the time that debaters ask the judges for something before the round, first of all, I don't see any adaptation as a result of that. If you're going to ask, you should adapt. If your audience says they don't like to see evidence, which I don't think they're ever going to say, but I've had that happen to me once, I don't quote anything, even though I have a pre-planned 1AC. No quotes this time. I'm going to refer to historical examples. Like whatever they say, you need to listen to and respond to. But most debaters I know have the same exact script, and they're going to give that case no matter what people say. I usually had around 8 versions of any case that we could mix and match things and change things up on the basis of what we learned about the audience. I also find that people are asking a terrible question, which is, what would you like to see? In Made to Stick, we've talked about how hard it is to think of a very vague notion. That's why in cross-examination we also don't say, what should the government do? We put leading questions in there. Would you agree with me that the government should first and foremost secure justice? Oh, yeah, I agree with that, or I disagree with that, whatever it is. We have to give them something specific. Saying what you like to see really makes, as a judge, you're like, oh no, this feels like a test. What am I supposed to say? I'm not sure. What do I like to see? And then they all say the same thing. I really want you to be clear and, use good logic, and let's have a good debate. That's what 9 out of 10 judges say, am I right? And then the other one is like, I used to debate blah, 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 blah. Okay, so let's put the former debater aside. asking what you like in a debate round, I think is a poor question. You should be instead asking something like that's relevant to you, because you're actually going to adapt. Usually that's, what's your experience in debate? Or what do you do for a living? If you're afraid that they might not do anything for a living, or that's probably a bad question. It's a risk. So think, what would you actually adapt on the basis of, and ask a question that elicits that, not what would you like to see in this round, or what's your judging philosophy, because most people struggle to answer that, and then they say be clear, which is funny, because if everybody's saying be clear, it probably means they're not feeling like most debaters are clear. Okay, next thing for winning out rounds is speak to the whole audience. You need to have wide gestures and look around and include the entire room, but then always come back to your judges. So you want to have that direct, piercing eye contact with the judges, but you also want to make it feel like there's a larger bubble than just the judges participating in the round. And it's really interesting, whenever you're on the judges table, you feel a little pressure, because you know the entire audience is behind you, usually, looking at you, and they're going to be judging your decision in some way, shape, or form. And then there's the other people at the table, and you're like worried, is it okay for me to laugh at this moment? Which is why many judging panels struggle to laugh, because even though it's legitimately funny, they're not sure what the judge next to them thinks. And so it has to be truly funny to get a laugh from a judging panel. You've probably noticed that even though the audience is laughing, a lot of times the judges are like very serious. And it's because they're thinking about, what do other people think about them? They're nervous. As much as you can, you need to be dispelling those nerves, including everyone, and making it be a comfortable place, because you're the one who owns the platform there. All right, what else about winning out rounds? The fewer arguments, the better. Especially later at night or in these long tournaments when people are tired, having 10 arguments is far less effective than having one or two big ones. And you're like, predict from the very beginning of the round. There's a disadvantage here, which is you're going to see that when it comes to the case of treason and the case of national security crimes, my opponent's case puts too much responsibility at the state level. And we're going to see that really clearly by looking at 5 different national security crimes that have been committed, and how their case, which have treated those 5 federal criminals or treasonous folks, versus how it was actually treated. That should be how you decide the round today. And you're like, boom, this is the one argument I'm going to make, and I'm going to make it really deep and interesting with lots of examples. What else about out rounds? Those are kind of the key points about winning out rounds. One mental hack is just don't get too down on yourself. I mean, how excited are you when you go 6-0? That rarely even happens for most debaters. You're like, going 5-1 feels pretty good, but you lost one. Well, in out rounds, each round you could win or lose, just like that one in prelims, except now theoretically you're against someone even harder and better. So to lose an out round, like everybody has to lose an out round except for one team. Everybody has to lose an out round. So it's not your entire life. It's just an out round. It feels big now, and it is. It's important, but don't let it become like this expression of who you are as a debater. The difference between someone who wins quarterfinals at nationals and someone who wins finals at nationals is 2 debate rounds out of hundreds and hundreds of speeches they've given over the course of probably the previous 3 years. It's just not that much a difference between the two. So don't overthink the out rounds. Okay, cool. Questions or thoughts? Assuming you guys are still there on Google Hangouts.
Yes.
Hi. No questions, but yes, you're there.
How much does looking better, seeming cooler, being a better team intangibly, how much does that play a part in winning?
The word is likability. So, not necessarily cooler or anything. It's likable. You want to be calm, collected, and you don't look like oh man, you're there for the first time because of how nervous you seem, and you also don't look like, oh, you're one of the kids because of the mob of people around you. Instead, you're a professional there as if you had just been invited to Harvard and you're giving a speech on this important policy matter. And we like you because you keep calm and yet you have a kind of fun sense of humor, make a few jokes about the format and the room, things like that. That matters so much because the audience early on in the round makes up their mind who they want to vote for. And then they spend the rest of the round determining whether or not they can justify that. That's the honest, cold, hard truth about judging. Early in the round, you determine who you want to vote for, and the rest of the round, you try to vote for them. The only time that's not true is when both sides are nice to each other and super likable and fun and interesting and entertaining. Then it's just like, whoa, that's really close. And that's the debate everybody walks out and like, this is great. I don't mind going out on this round. Both sides say that because, man, that was awesome. Other than that, your audience has kind of made up their mind who they want to vote for. So likability is one of the most influencing factors that you have at that level of debate. Because we already know your strategies head-to-head are both going to be pretty decent. You're good debaters. Likability is going to be one of the determining factors. Any other thoughts or questions on that? Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to stop this thingy.